In 1901, a single business transaction in New York City transferred more wealth than the entire annual budget of the United States government. J.P. Morgan handed Andrew Carnegie a check for $480 million, buying a steel company headquartered not in New York, not in Chicago, but in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That sale created the world's first billion-dollar corporation, United States Steel. And it meant that for one brief, astonishing moment at the turn of the 20th century, the most consequential industrial address in the world was a smoky city wedged into the hills where two rivers meet to form a third. But here's the part most people don't know. During Pittsburgh's peak years, roughly 1830 to 1930, the city housed more millionaires per capita than New York. The names on the mailboxes along Fifth Avenue in the Shadyside neighborhood read like a roll call of American capitalism. Carnegie, Mellon, Frick, Westinghouse, Heinz. They called it Millionaires' Row, and it wasn't a metaphor. These men played poker together on Thursday evenings in each other's breakfast rooms, surrounded by aluminum ceilings that cost more per square foot than gold, while their fortunes were being built in the blast furnaces glowing orange along the Monongahela River below. To understand how all of that happened, and how nearly all of it went away, you have to go back to a point of land where two rivers converge, and a war that most Americans have mostly forgotten. The spot where the Allegheny River flowing from the north meets the Monongahela River flowing from the south to form the westward running Ohio was for centuries one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate on the continent. The rivers were highways. Whoever controlled that junction controlled trade and movement across an enormous swath of the interior. Native peoples, the Lenape, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, had known this for generations. By the 1740s, an English fur trader named William Trent had built a small trading post at the Forks and was doing brisk business with the local tribes, growing wealthy in the process. The French noticed. In the early 1750s, they began constructing a chain of forts stretching south from Lake Erie, Fort Presque Isle, Fort Le Boeuf, Fort Machaut, tightening a military grip on the Ohio country. In 1754, when a small detachment of Virginia militiamen tried to build a modest fortification at the Forks, a much larger French force arrived and chased them off. The French demolished the half-built British structure and erected Fort Duquesne, named for the Governor-General of New France. It was a rough stockade of logs, but its power was in its location, not its walls. A 22-year-old lieutenant colonel named George Washington was dispatched to do something about it. His first attempt ended in the skirmish at Jumonville Glen and the humiliation of Fort Necessity. A year later, General Edward Braddock led a much larger British expedition toward the Forks, and Washington rode with him. Braddock's column was ambushed before it ever reached the fort. More than half of Braddock's 1,200 men were killed or wounded, including Braddock himself, who was buried in the roadbed of the very road he'd been building, his grave hidden under the marching boots of his retreating soldiers, so the enemy wouldn't find it. It took the British 4 years and a third expedition, this one led by General John Forbes, who was himself dying of a wasting disease, to finally take the Forks. When Forbes's army arrived on November 25, 1758, they found Fort Duquesne in smoldering ruins. The French, outnumbered and cut off from resupply, had detonated their own powder magazine and fled. Forbes, carried on a litter, surveyed the smoking wreckage and named the place Pittsburgh, after William Pitt, the British Secretary of State who had masterminded the war strategy. Forbes would be dead within weeks, but the name stuck. The British built Fort Pitt on the site, 10 times the size of the French fort, a massive pentagonal earthwork with 5 bastions, and around it a village began to grow. By 1761, the fort commandant counted 149 civilians living in the settlement, besides the soldiers. A blockhouse built near the fort in 1764 still stands today, believed to be the oldest building in Pittsburgh, quietly tucked behind a modern parking structure at Point State Park. You can walk right past it and never notice. For the next several decades, Pittsburgh was a frontier town, muddy, rough, and strategically important, mostly because it sat at the head of the Ohio River, the Great Western Highway. Flatboats and keelboats departed from its wharves, carrying settlers and goods deeper into the continent. The town grew slowly. By 1800, the population was around 1,700. By 1820, it had reached about 7,000. The place smelled of coal smoke even then. An observer in 1823 noted that the soot from the furnaces coated walls and left the men in the streets looking, as he put it, as black as the devil himself. When Charles Dickens visited in 1842, he wrote that Pittsburgh had a great quantity of smoke hanging over it. He was not being complimentary. Then on April 10, 1845, everything changed. Or rather, everything burned. It was a warm, windy Thursday. The city had gone 6 weeks without rain. The reservoir was dangerously low. The air was thick with the usual cocktail of coal dust, flour particles, and cotton fibers from the mills, an atmosphere so combustible that it only needed a spark. Shortly before noon, a woman named Ann Brooks, working on Ferry Street, left a fire she'd lit to heat wash water unattended for just a moment. A gust carried an ember to a nearby ice shed. Within minutes, the flames leapt to a cotton factory across the street. The city's 10 volunteer fire companies, which were more social clubs than firefighting organizations, scrambled to respond. But there were only 2 water mains for the entire city, and the hoses couldn't reach the center of town from the river. The pumpers drew nothing but mud. By 2 in the afternoon, the fire was a rolling wall consuming entire blocks. The Monongahela House, the finest hotel in the West, collapsed when its cupola caught fire. The Bank of Pittsburgh, supposedly fireproof, held out until the heat shattered its windows and melted its zinc roof, and the molten metal ignited the wooden interior. Only the vault survived. The city's only bridge across the Monongahela, a wooden structure at Smithfield Street, fell in 10 minutes. By 7 that evening, the fire had consumed about a third of Pittsburgh. More than 1,000 buildings were gone. 1,200 businesses destroyed. 12,000 people homeless. The damage was estimated at around $12 million, something like $400 million in today's money. 2 people died, which seems almost miraculously few given the scale of the destruction. And here is where the Pittsburgh character reveals itself for the first time. The state legislature granted the city $50,000 in relief and a 3-year reprieve from taxes. But it was the city's industrialists who reframed the catastrophe as an opportunity. The demand for replacement homes, replacement goods, replacement everything spurred local manufacturing. Within a few years, the fire was being described not as a disaster, but as the event that cleared away a ramshackle frontier town and made room for a real city. Pittsburgh rebuilt in brick and stone. The wooden sidewalks were replaced. The streets were straightened. And the Smithfield Street Bridge rose again, this time designed by John Augustus Roebling, the same engineer who would later design the Brooklyn Bridge. That bridge would be rebuilt once more in 1883 as a steel structure, one of the oldest steel bridges in the United States, and it's still standing, still carrying traffic across the Monongahela, with the words Cloman Patent Process, 1881, stamped into the eye-bars of its original spans. If you walk across it today, you're walking on Pittsburgh's own steel, forged in Pittsburgh's own mills, proof of the material that would make the city's fortune. The Smithfield Street Bridge would prove to be a kind of prophecy in steel and stone, a declaration that Pittsburgh's future would be built not of wood, but of metal. And the metal that mattered most was about to change. Before steel, there was iron, and before iron, there was glass. Pittsburgh had been manufacturing glass since the early 1800s, its furnaces fueled by the seemingly inexhaustible coal seams in the surrounding hills. By mid-century, iron foundries lined the riverbanks, their smoke merging with the glass factories' haze into the perpetual twilight that became the city's most distinctive and least appealing characteristic. The rivers were choked with barges carrying coal, pig iron, and manufactured goods. The population doubled and doubled again. 46,000 in 1850, nearly 77,000 by 1860, climbing past 150,000 by 1880. Most of the newcomers were immigrants, Irish, German, Welsh, Scottish, drawn by the promise of industrial work that paid better than farming, even if it killed you faster. By the 1870s, the age of steel was arriving, and Pittsburgh was perfectly positioned to dominate it. The geography that had made the forks strategically valuable in wartime made them economically valuable in peacetime. The rivers provided cheap transportation for raw materials and finished goods. The hills surrounding the city contained enormous deposits of coal, the fuel that fired the blast furnaces. Iron ore could be shipped in from the Great Lakes. And the Pennsylvania Railroad, whose Western Division had its headquarters in Pittsburgh, connected the city to eastern markets. Everything a steelmaker needed was either right there or easily brought in. The man who understood this better than anyone else arrived in Pittsburgh as a 13-year-old Scottish immigrant in 1848, the son of a hand-loom weaver whose trade had been destroyed by mechanization. Andrew Carnegie went to work at age 12 in a cotton factory, earning $1.20 a week. At 14, he became a messenger boy at the Pittsburgh Telegraph Office, where his quickness caught the attention of Thomas Scott, superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division. Scott made Carnegie his personal secretary. Carnegie was 24 years old when the Civil War began, and he went to Washington as Scott's right-hand man when Scott was named Assistant Secretary of War. But Carnegie was watching, calculating, learning. He visited British steel mills and saw the future. In 1872, he entered the iron business. 3 years later, he opened his first steel mill, the J. Edgar Thompson Steel Works in Braddock, just outside Pittsburgh, and introduced the Bessemer process to American manufacturing, a technology that could convert pig iron into steel in minutes rather than days. The effect on cost and output was staggering. Carnegie hired Captain William Jones, a brilliant steelmaker he'd lured from a competitor during a labor strike, as superintendent. Jones invented processes that eliminated entire steps in production, developed an esprit de corps among the workers, and convinced Carnegie to introduce the 8-hour day, a reform the company would later reverse, going back to 12-hour shifts when profitability demanded it. Carnegie's genius was not only technical but structural. He pioneered what would later be called vertical integration, owning everything from the iron ore mines in Minnesota to the railroads that carried the ore to the coke ovens that processed the coal to the mills that made the steel. Every step in the supply chain was his. Every middleman was eliminated. Every penny of margin was captured. He also made a practice that was revolutionary for the time. He hired a chemist to work on the shop floor. Something that sounds unremarkable now, but that was a radical departure from an industry that had traditionally relied on guesswork and experience. The result was that Carnegie's men reinvented iron-making 3 times in 3 consecutive decades. And it was during this period that iron-making was first recognized as a science rather than a craft, a transformation attributed by industry experts to the work done at Carnegie's mills. By the late 1880s, Carnegie Steel was producing about a quarter of all the steel in the world. The company's profits were staggering. A record $4.5 million in the year before the Homestead Strike, which prompted Carnegie himself to exclaim in a letter, "Was there ever such a business?" Workers performed 12-hour shifts 7 days a week with 1 holiday per year, the 4th of July. Weekly pay was around $10. Fatal accidents were common. The mills ran around the clock, the blast furnaces glowing against the night sky, the rivers reflecting orange light. A steel worker named Ken Kobus, who was 3rd generation at the Jones and Laughlin plant on the south side, later recalled that his father, even on his deathbed and delirious with medication, kept making motions with his hands and arms that mystified the doctors. But Kobus recognized them immediately. His father was making steel, opening furnace doors, adjusting the gas. To the day he died, he lived steel-making. And then came Homestead. In 1892, the contract between the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers and Carnegie Steel was set to expire. Carnegie was in Scotland. He left his chairman, Henry Clay Frick, the coke king who had made his own fortune turning western Pennsylvania coal into the fuel that fed the blast furnaces, in charge. Frick built a 10-foot fence topped with barbed wire around the Homestead Steel Works and announced he would bargain only with individual workers, not the union. The workers called it Fort Frick. On the night of July 5th, 300 Pinkerton agents assembled on the Ohio River, 5 miles below Pittsburgh. Many had been hired out of lodging houses for $2.50 a day and had no idea what their assignment was. They were given Winchester rifles, loaded onto 2 barges, and towed upriver toward Homestead. The strikers were waiting. Lookouts had spotted the barges passing under the Smithfield Street Bridge in the pre-dawn darkness. By 4 in the morning, thousands of men, women, and children had flooded to the riverbank. When the Pinkertons tried to come ashore, someone fired. Nobody knows who shot first. For the next 12 hours, a pitched battle raged along the Monongahela. The workers hauled a Civil War cannon to the riverbank and fired on the barges. They poured oil on the river and tried to set it ablaze. They rolled a burning freight car toward the landing. By the time the Pinkertons surrendered, 7 workers and 3 agents were dead. The aftermath was worse for the workers than the battle. The governor sent 8,500 National Guard troops to restore order. Frick hired replacement workers. More than 100 union leaders were arrested. By November, the union collapsed. Daily wages for skilled workers at Homestead dropped by 1/5 over the next 15 years, and shifts went from 8 hours back to 12. Carnegie from Scotland expressed regret. But the union was broken, and steel production continued to climb. Frick survived an assassination attempt that July. A young anarchist named Alexander Berkman walked into his office and shot him twice and stabbed him 3 times. And Frick, bleeding on the floor, reportedly told the doctors to finish their work so he could return to his desk that afternoon. He did. The relationship between Frick and Carnegie eventually soured into one of the great business feuds of the age. But in 1901, Frick helped broker the sale of Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan. The $480 million transaction created U.S. Steel and made Carnegie one of the richest men in the history of the world. What Carnegie and Frick and the Mellons and Westinghouse and Hines built with that wealth turned Pittsburgh into something extraordinary, a city of astonishing contrasts, where the soot-blackened sky hung above some of the grandest architecture in the country. Consider what Pittsburgh looked like at its peak in the years between about 1900 and 1930. The Smithfield Street Bridge, with its lenticular trusses, carried streetcars and pedestrians across the Monongahela, its steel portals decorated with grotesque stone faces of workmen. From the bridge, you could look up and see the city climbing the hills in every direction: church steeples, factory stacks, the cables of incline railways cutting diagonal lines up the mountainsides. Pittsburgh had 17 inclines at its peak, funicular railways hauling workers from the river valleys up to the hillside neighborhoods where they lived. The Monongahela Incline, opened in 1870, the first passenger funicular in the United States, built by a Prussian engineer named John Endres for $50,000, carried 45 people at a time up 367 feet of hillside at a 35-degree grade. The Duquesne Incline followed in 1877. At their peak, the inclines were not tourist attractions. They were infrastructure, as essential to their neighborhoods as the streetcar lines running along the valley floors below. Along Fifth Avenue and Shadyside, the mansions rose behind iron gates and manicured hedges. Frick's home, Clayton, a 23-room chateau with an aluminum ceiling in the reception room, aluminum then being worth more per ounce than gold, sat among its gardens with a greenhouse designed by the same architects Carnegie hired for his library. The breakfast room where Frick hosted his Thursday poker games with Hines, Mellon, and Westinghouse had a child's high chair in the corner. Down the avenue, Richard B. Mellon built a 65-room mansion in 1910. He tore it down 30 years later when it was barely a generation old because the upkeep had become impractical. Today, the grounds are a public park, and the mansion's carved stonework was salvaged and installed in a church in New Kensington. In the heart of downtown, Henry Clay Frick, the same man who had sent the Pinkertons to Homestead, spent $6 million to build the William Penn Hotel, which opened on March 11, 1916. The head chef came from the Plaza in New York. The maitre d' came from the Savoy in London. Its 2-story lobby was designed in the Italian Renaissance style, with marble floors, coffered ceilings, and crystal chandeliers. The hotel's first night hosted the Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce Gala with the United States Secretary of State presiding, and it was recorded as the largest gala in city history to that point. In 1929, an Art Deco expansion doubled the building, adding a ballroom designed by the Viennese theatrical designer Joseph Urban, with a blue and gold color scheme and soaring columns that made the room feel like the inside of a jewel box. The William Penn became the second largest hotel in the world, with 1,600 rooms. On any given evening in the 1920s, you could walk into that lobby and hear big band music drifting from the Urban Room, which broadcast live performances over the hotel's own radio station. Lawrence Welk got his start in that room. Count Basie and his orchestra played the Chatterbox Lounge in January of 1937, and the live broadcast was recorded, the first known recording of the Basie Band with Lester Young and Buck Clayton. The guest registers read like a who's who of American power. Presidents, senators, movie stars, industrialists cutting deals over dinner in the terrace room beneath its original walnut paneling and molded plaster ceiling. And just across town, an entirely different kind of cultural revolution was happening. Pittsburgh, it turns out, didn't just forge steel. It forged the modern world's ability to hear itself. On the evening of November 2nd, 1920, 5 men sat in a wooden shack that had been hastily erected on the roof of the Westinghouse electric plant in East Pittsburgh. Inside, they had a microphone, a transmitter with 100 watts of power, and a telephone line running to the newsroom of the Pittsburgh Post. Leo Rosenberg, acting as announcer, read the returns of the Harding-Cox presidential election into the microphone, interspersed with phonograph records. He asked anyone listening to please communicate with the station, as they were anxious to know how far the broadcast was reaching. That was the first scheduled commercial radio broadcast in American history, and the station was KDKA. Westinghouse had gotten the idea from one of its engineers, Frank Conrad, who had been making amateur broadcasts from his garage in Wilkinsburg, playing records, giving sports scores, chatting, and a local department store, Joseph Horn, had started selling radio receivers for $10 apiece to people who wanted to listen. A Westinghouse executive named H.P. Davis saw one of the store's advertisements and recognized what he later called a limitless opportunity. Create programming, and people would buy receivers. Within a year, KDKA had broadcast the first live sporting event, a boxing match, the first live baseball game, the first football game, and the first presidential inaugural address. By 1922, there were 500 radio stations across the country, all of them following the model that had been invented in Pittsburgh. By 1910, Pittsburgh was the source of more than 60% of the nation's steel. The population of the city proper had surged past 500,000 after the annexation of Allegheny City in 1907. The city had 446 bridges, more than Venice, spanning its 3 rivers and countless ravines, many of them built with locally produced steel. In 1926, construction began on the Three Sisters Bridges, the 6th, 7th, and 9th Street bridges across the Allegheny, the first self-anchored suspension bridges in America, and the only trio of identical bridges in the United States. Each one painted the distinctive Aztec gold that became Pittsburgh's signature color. In the early decades of the 20th century, if you stood on the observation platform at the top of the Duquesne Incline and looked out over the Golden Triangle, the wedge of downtown Pittsburgh formed by the converging rivers, you saw a city that was making the physical substance of modern America. The steel in the Brooklyn Bridge, the steel in the skyscrapers rising in Manhattan, the steel in the railroad tracks spanning the continent, the armor plate on the Navy's battleships. It came from here, from these mills lining these rivers, poured by these men working these 12-hour shifts in this heat that, as one steel worker later recalled, made the sweat run into your shoes so you were squishing around in your own sweat until you were spent and felt you couldn't move. The view from that incline platform was magnificent and terrible at the same time. On a clear day, and clear days were rare, you could see the rivers glinting, the bridges arcing, the church steeples catching the light. On most days, the smoke from hundreds of furnaces and coke ovens hung in the valleys like fog, gray and softening, as one writer described it, turning noon into twilight. Streetlights burned at midday. Women hung their laundry out to dry and brought it back in dirtier than when they'd put it out. A journalist visiting in the early 1900s reported that a white shirt turned gray in a single afternoon. But underneath all that smoke, there was money. Enormous, world-shaping amounts of money. Carnegie gave away $350 million before he died in 1919, building 3,000 public libraries across the country, founding the Carnegie Institute of Technology, endowing the Carnegie Institute of Pittsburgh with its museum and music hall. Andrew Mellon served as Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents. George Westinghouse, whose electrical company was headquartered in Pittsburgh, had championed alternating current against Thomas Edison's direct current and won, electrifying cities across the nation. H.J. Heinz built a food empire from a horseradish recipe. These men didn't just extract wealth from Pittsburgh, they reinvested it. The Carnegie Library, the Mellon Institute, the University of Pittsburgh with its Cathedral of Learning, a 42-story Gothic tower that remains the tallest educational building in the Western Hemisphere. These were institutions built to outlast the industries that funded them. Carnegie alone built 3,000 public libraries across the English-speaking world, 380 of them in Britain. He founded the Carnegie Institute of Technology. He endowed the Carnegie Institute of Pittsburgh with its museum and music hall. He established the Endowment for International Peace. By the time he died in 1919, he had given away $350 million and placed another $125 million in the Carnegie Corporation to carry on the work. But Pittsburgh's cultural life wasn't only the province of millionaires and their endowments. In the Hill District, just above downtown, a neighborhood of African-American families, many of them descendants of migrants who had come north during and after World War I seeking work in the mills, created one of the most vibrant jazz and blues scenes in the country. Clubs along Wiley Avenue hosted musicians who would go on to become legends. The neighborhood was dense, alive, self-contained, a city within a city with its own businesses, churches, newspapers, and nightlife. Pittsburgh produced artists and musicians who carried the city's gritty, creative energy far beyond its borders. The pop art pioneer Andy Warhol grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Oakland, the son of Carpatho-Rusyn immigrants. The playwright August Wilson set nearly all of his major works in the Hill District, chronicling the lives of black Pittsburghers across the 20th century. And this is a detail that matters, because the institutions Carnegie and Mellon built are the reason Pittsburgh survived what came next, and cities like Youngstown and Gary did not. The decline didn't announce itself with a single catastrophe. It crept in. The seeds were planted early, much earlier than most people realize. Steel production had actually been moving away from Pittsburgh from the earliest part of the 20th century, as new mills opened closer to ore supplies and consumer markets. The Great Depression masked this shift, and then World War II reversed it entirely. Pittsburgh's mills ran 24 hours a day to supply steel for battleships, tanks, and aircraft, and the city was called the foundation of the arsenal of democracy. By the late 1940s, Pittsburgh was producing nearly half of the nation's steel. But the 1950 census recorded the city's peak population at 676,806, and the number never went higher. In fact, the city's population had essentially topped out even earlier. Without the annexation of Allegheny City decades before, the decline would have been visible much sooner. Net out-migration of workers had begun as early as the 1920s, concentrated among younger, working-age men. After the war, several things happened at once. Foreign competitors, first Japan, rebuilding its economy with newer, more efficient mills, then Brazil and South Korea, began eating into American steelmakers' market share. American steel companies, dominant for so long, had underinvested in new technology. The open hearth furnaces that had been state-of-the-art in 1900 were still running in 1970, while competitors were using basic oxygen furnaces that could make steel in 40 minutes instead of 8 hours. The steel makers, focused on avoiding labor unrest that might shut down production, negotiated a series of increasingly generous contracts with the unions, passing the rising costs along to customers. For a while, in a growing market, this worked. And then it stopped working. The oil crisis of 1973 hammered the economy. Demand for steel dropped. The industries that consumed the most steel, railroads, heavy construction, were themselves contracting. And the wages that steel workers had won through decades of hard bargaining, which had lifted generations of families into the middle class, now made American steel uncompetitive against foreign imports produced at a fraction of the labor cost. When the recession of 1981 hit, the Pittsburgh steel industry didn't bend. It broke. Between 1980 and 1983, roughly 95,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in the Pittsburgh area. Unemployment in some communities reached 27%. Mills that had employed thousands of workers, providing a pathway to middle-class life for entire generations, shut down, most of them permanently. The business math was brutal. American steel companies had lost $3 billion in 1982 alone, hemorrhaging money on every ton they sold. The Homestead Works, which had employed 15,000 workers, which had been the site of the Battle of 1892, which by 1900 was producing 8% of the world's steel, shut down for good in 1986. Jones and Laughlin, the fourth largest steel producer in the world at its peak, which had employed 45,000 workers and produced over 4.5 million tons of steel a year, merged with a French conglomerate in 1974 and then collapsed. From 1981 to 1986, the majority of the region's steel mills were shuttered, and 153,000 steel workers lost their jobs. Over 75% of the steelmaking capacity near Pittsburgh was gone. One former worker at the Duquesne Works remembered the moment the Dorothy No. 6 blast furnace went cold. Once that shut down, everything got quiet, he said. It was like coming out of a cemetery. In the Hill District, a different kind of loss had already taken place. In the 1950s, the city's urban renewal program had demolished much of the lower hill to build the Civic Arena, displacing 1,500 mostly black residents and over 400 businesses. The neighborhood that had produced so much music, so much culture, so much life, was gutted in the name of progress. The Fort Pitt Incline had closed in 1953. The Castle Shannon Incline closed in 1965. The Knoxville Incline, the Mount Oliver Incline, the St. Clair Incline, all of them went quiet, their lower stations demolished, their hillside paths overgrown. Of the original 17, only 2 survived, the Monongahela and the Duquesne. Young workers left the region by the thousands. The Pittsburgh region lost nearly half its population between 1965 and 1990. There's a reason, as one historian noted, that there are Steelers bars in every city in America. It's not because everyone loves the Steelers. It's because workers from Pittsburgh ended up everywhere. The population of the city proper fell from that 1950 peak of 676,000 to around 300,000, a drop of more than 55%. Pittsburgh went from being the 12th largest city in America to the 68th. The site of the Homestead Works is now a shopping center called the Waterfront. There is an AMC movie theater where the open hearth furnaces once stood. A few relics remain. Some smokestacks, a section of railroad track, historical markers that most shoppers walk past without reading. The William Penn Hotel still stands on its block downtown, still hosting events in the Urban Room with its blue and gold Art Deco columns. It has been renamed, renovated, and passed through a succession of corporate owners, but the lobby is still marble, the chandeliers still crystal, the terrace room still paneled in walnut. If you stand in that lobby on a quiet weekday afternoon, you can almost hear the big band music drifting down from the ballroom above, and the clink of champagne glasses, and the murmur of deals being made in the language of steel and coke and tonnage and futures. The Smithfield Street Bridge still crosses the Monongahela, its lenticular trusses still bearing the stamp of the mill that made them in 1881. The streetcar tracks that once ran across its deck were pulled up in 1985 when the last streetcar crossed the bridge at 1:40 in the morning on July 7th, and the right-of-way was paved over for automobile traffic. The stone grotesques of workmen still stare from the portals, their faces blackened not by soot. The air is clean now, cleaner than it's been in 200 years, but by age. The 2 remaining inclines still climb Mount Washington, carrying about 1 million riders a year between them, roughly half commuters and half tourists. The view from the top is still extraordinary. The rivers converging, the bridges crossing, the golden triangle spread out below. It is the view that most people picture when they think of Pittsburgh. But the orange glow of the blast furnaces is gone from the river valleys, and the smoke that once turned noon into twilight has dissolved into clear skies, and the hillside neighborhoods that the other 15 inclines once served have found other ways up and down, or have simply grown quieter, their populations smaller, their commercial streets thinner. On the observation platform of the Duquesne Incline, there is a small museum in the upper station, with framed black and white photographs on the wood-paneled walls, showing what Pittsburgh looked like when steel was king and 17 inclines ran and the rivers glowed at night. Visitors study the photographs, and then they turn and look out at the city through the glass, and what they see is beautiful and different and somehow incomplete. A skyline that has been cleaned and polished and partially emptied. A city that reinvented itself around medicine, education, technology, and finance, but that carries in its bridges and its remaining towers and its 2 surviving inclines the structural memory of something much larger, something that built a nation and then quietly stepped aside. The cables still hum. The cars still pass each other at the midpoint, counterweights in an old equation. The platform is silent except for the mechanical rhythm of the machinery below, doing what it has done since 1877, lifting people up and letting them down, and lifting them up again.